Welcome to the Neijiaquan podcast. My name is Isaac Kamens. This is a bi-weekly podcast where my friend Jess O'Brien and I discuss internal martial arts, Qigong, and meditation. This week we continue our discussion on Sun Ludong's Bagua Zhang. First we give his short description of the origins of Bagua Zhang. Then we look at the Book of Change and the relation to the body, the way Sun Ludong breaks it down. Then he has 9 points, sort of advice for training that we'd look at. And in the Patreon portion of the episode, we discuss the technique of rise, drill, overturn, and fall, which we mentioned in the episode, but we go into a lot more detail and give some pointers on how to actually do that technique. It relates to both Qigong and Bagua Zhang and Xingyi. So if you're interested in that, take a listen. We also have exclusive episodes and longer interviews. So check it out. Again, thanks for listening. Take care and enjoy the episode.
Now we're going to move on to some of the history of Bagua from Sun Ludong's Bagua book of 1916. The next thing he talks about is the origins of Bagua boxing. Now he says that Bagua boxing began during the time period of 1850 to 1875 when Dong I-Ching of Hebei province was roaming through the southern provinces. At Mount Yuhua, he was taught by an extraordinary man an art called Bagua. So that's the legend that Dong I-Ching learned it from a Taoist, mysterious Taoist in the mountains that he would never truly identify. And the students always wanted to know where the art came from. Yeah. But wherever it came from, Master Dong is the beginning of it. And so that's just the only paragraph on the topic. That's it.
Well, that's, I think, as much as anybody's ever really been able to concretely say is that the modern martial art of Bagua Zhang originated,
as we know it, right?
Yeah, originated with this one guy and then split into two different systems.
And so is that where Cheng Tinghua was telling Sun Ludong to go to the roots of Bagua in the southern mountains?
It sounds like it.
So now he dives into the Book of Changes. So let me say, so the first sentence he says here, and we'll unpack this. He says, the Book of Changes says, non-polarity generated the grand polarity. The grand polarity generated the dual aspects. The dual aspects generated the four manifestations, and the four manifestations generated the 8 trigrams. Now, this is a deep piece of Chinese philosophy, but he's applying it to Bagua.
Yeah.
So non-polarity refers to Wu Ji, nothingness, right?
Right. So there's emptiness or nothingness. And then there's Tai Chi, which is yin and, the yin and yang.
Yin and yang are generated from that nothingness.
Right. And then it's that split of when yin and yang separate into a yang yin, a yin yin, a yin yang, and a yang yang. Right. Now you have those 4 elements. And when those combine, you then get the 8 trigrams. But that's just sort of laying out the metaphysical way of looking at it, right? That you're starting with 1, you go to 2, from 2 you go to 4.
We go from 0 technically, 0 to 1 to 2 to 4 to 8, and from there everything is created. That's this creation story.
Right, and the phrase that's frequently used is the myriad of 10,000 things or something like that, where once you combine those 8, you can make all of the rest of the changes.
And he says here, the boxing art is the theory of utilizing the 8 trigrams. What does this mean? So he begins by talking about the abdomen, and from there, the navel is the grand polarity, which might refer to the dantian. The kidneys, it then splits into the kidneys, or the dual aspect, where it splits into yin and yang. Then the arms and legs are the 4 manifestations, like you were saying, the yin and yang combo, much yin, little yang, and little yin, big yang. Then they generate the 8 trigrams by the way of the 2 joints of each limb. So elbow, knee, wrist, ankle. That's the 8 trigrams are the sort of how your limbs expand from the center. It's a manifestation of that same process of from 0 to 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. You go from your dantian and all those links out to the 8 joints of your limbs. Well, then Sun Ludong decides to take it even further and even into incoherence by saying, you then multiply this 8 by 8 to make 64. The 10 fingers each have 3 joints, except for the thumbs, which only have 2. Well, this totals an additional 24. Then adding the 4 joints of the thumbs brings the additional total up to 28. Then adding the same joints of the toes of the feet brings the total up to 56. Then the 8 limb joints combined, this makes for 64 joints. The 64 hexagrams in this way make the basis of the boxing art. Then the 384 lines of the hexagrams interact to produce effects.
All of that was to say the first run through essentially of the 64 is your physical body. That's what I was saying before. The structure of it is you do the whole thing in your physical body first. Then you can go to the next one.
Out to the furthest tips. Right. He counts up to 384 lines of hexagrams. Right. But I think you're right, though. Just the whole concept is everything inside your body is part of this I-Ching framework, basically.
It's just that first energy, right? That first Gua is about
heaven,
which is the physical body. And
heaven energy contains everything within it,
and all and all of the things that are inside of your body essentially develop into all the other pieces of it, right?
So his next paragraph, he talks about the body has 8 trigrams internally, while the 4 limbs create the 8 trigrams externally. So you can divide it up into the 8 sort of sections of your inner body, then the 8 parts of your external body. Use the theory of the 8 trigrams to make the substance of the 8 trigrams, then use the substance to train the theory. This explains why the structure of the art of Bagua boxing is so named. So these inner and outer sides of the body inform each other.
Right. So that he essentially just described what I was referring to earlier as the pre-heaven method, where you start from the inside and it develops into these changes, right? So you start with the 8 and it develops into the 64, and then the 64 develops into the rest of it. And that's the from inside to outside approach of Bagua Zhang.
To the 384.
Right. Well, and it goes even beyond that. I mean,
right, into the millions. Well, then after all that multiplication and expansion, now he returns to the root where he says, seek for a state of centered harmoniousness, energy returning to your elixir field. Contained within this is the idea that when stillness reaches its peak, there is movement. And when movement reaches its peak, there is stillness. This up and down switching of states, in the way that the trigrams composing a hexagram can be flipped above and below to produce a new hexagram, is called internal breathing. This is straight out of Taoist alchemy.
Right. This is the golden elixir, or the microcosmic orbit, this connection between heaven and earth, right?
And then the flipping of the trigrams, which you find in a lot of literature about Taoist alchemy.
Well, that's what creates the elixir, is that once you flip these two things, they combine in a different way to create this a golden elixir is the way it's frequently
Neijiaquan, internal.
Right. And so what he's saying is,
internal energy.
He's saying after you develop all of this physical movement stuff, you bring it back to the center because it has to connect to that part of it.
He says Qi comes returning to the Dantian.
Well,
which is an exhortation that so many martial arts internal styles
that comes
often say.
Right. That comes from the Lu Dongbin's 100-character tablet, where he says the elixir field will return to itself or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So there's this sense that by using these trigrams, you shift them in a certain way to re-energize your body, I think is one of the alchemical meanings of this.
This is the first, generally the first practice you do it to go from physical practices like Neigong, for example, to what they refer to as Neidan, or internal alchemy, right? The practices of how to change the inside of your goo versus just how to get in touch with the goo. So Neigong, Qigong is about waking up the inside of your body, connecting to it, making it alive, making it unified, And then the Neijiaquan, or the spiritual practice, is about waking up the energies inside of it and
transforming them, changing them, doing,
right,
actively changing them in some way.
And this came from 1,000 years of people killing themselves with mercury and lead and all sorts of other horrible shit, trying to find an elixir of long life, that you could actually ingest, and they never worked out. So then they shifted to this idea of, well, maybe there's an immortal elixir that we can find somewhere else. And that's
like your own inner body is some sort of chemistry lab that you can transform with those organs and stuff.
Yeah. Which is a really wild concept.
Yeah,
but that's what a lot of the Taoist elements of Bagua kind of are based on, that, or
they're drawing from that stream is flowing into internal martial arts. He says here, this boxing art is interrelated with Taoist practices, not only in this way. The trigrams are also each associated with animals. For instance, the dragon associated with thunder trigram, horse with heaven trigram, cow with earth trigram, and so on, all represented by animals. Which I've encountered some Bagua styles that have animal attachments, but he's doing it differently. A lot of times dragon is associated with heaven, but here he has dragon associated with thunder and horse associated with heaven. So I think different schools have different animals plugged into different trigrams in different patterns and different orders, So then he switches back again to some of this internal work. The mind is internal, yet its reasoning extends to all things outside. Things are external, yet their principles are all here in the mind. For what is near, examine within the self. For what is distant, observe all things. Another sort of awareness training of your inner awareness and your outer awareness, and how they're both so important, basically.
The form is formlessness, and the formlessness is form. This is the Heart Sutra, right? This idea. And this is one of the central ideas in all Taoist practices, is that you have a physical thing and a non-physical thing that are linked.
Mind, body,
mind, body, energy, spirit. Whichever one of these things you want to use, there's always that pairing, and that's just kind of how they work. I don't, it's
I think it's part of this trend in internal martial arts of saying you can't just punch a punching bag to get the most out of this. That's part of it, but for all your physical actions, there's the mind. There's something about the mind and this inner awareness that is a common thread.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, to take it out of just the fighting part, and to make it as I-Ching said, the practice doesn't stop when you finish the form, right? That you can make these things into a sort of continuous practice, because it becomes part of how you move, right?
And here he's making this case in somewhere around 1920, really trying to hammer home how important it is to shift from a strictly fighting mindset to this cultivation, and carries on to this day.
He was one of the pioneers of that idea that you can do this stuff for more than just killing people, really, that it can be a practice of making yourself healthy, or making yourself calm, or whatever, right? And that you have these elements inside of it, these forces, right, which are what make it do that. And then you can move in a way that kind of enhances it, right? So the idea that you're not making anything happen, you're tapping into stuff that's already there.
So he says here, there is limitless alternating between direct and indirect techniques. There is also hardness and softness assisting each other, so that emptiness and fullness are mutually achieved. And you can be empty, but not empty. Not empty, and yet empty. Such are the subtleties of Bagua boxing. Yeah. It's just one contradiction after another. That's very Taoist.
Yeah. It's this, but it's that, but it ain't this, but it's also that.
It ain't this, but it is that.
And it just keeps that. I think
keeps you guessing.
It keeps you guessing, but it also keeps you from fixating on something. And I think that's the piece that I always took, because I never really studied any of. I did a little bit, but my interest was in much more in doing it than understanding the theory behind it. But the piece that always kept coming up in doing it is somehow you have to reconcile these opposing things, whether it be your top and bottom, your inside and your outside, your left side and your right side. I mean, there's a million different opposites that you're going to contend with. I mean, the first one usually that pops up for a lot of people, they try to lift their head up and their chest pops up. They try to drop their chest and their neck goes forward. And just that battle between, if I straighten myself up, I kind of feel like I'm falling backwards versus if I slump forward, I'm falling forwards. That there's somewhere in the middle where you don't feel like you're fighting yourself. And that's kind of this element of finding balance, of finding yin and, as they put it, yin and yang, heaven and earth, all these different.
So that you're not fighting yourself. I think that's a good way to put it. If you keep in mind all these opposites and these dichotomies, that way you don't clench in one particular direction, because there's always balance by another direction that helps you smooth that out and get that unified feeling that you're looking for.
Yeah, and change is specifically about not getting stuck in any particular thing, right? That if you're constantly going from this direction, and this is directly to the practice of walking the circle, if you're constantly shifting your weight forward and back, and then you're constantly turning around and going in the other direction, you can't really get too attached to one particular thing, because it's always changing. So what you end up having to get in contact with is the comfort of change, and that's really difficult. But that's what you're looking for, is stop looking for a place to be comfortable and just be comfortable in the movement.
That is harder to do than it is to say,
for sure. But that, I think, is what a lot of these, if it's this, but it's that, are really trying to get you to do is deal with that sort of struggle.
So now, moving beyond the philosophy, he gets down and dirty with some nuts and bolts practice advice for Bagua, which I wanted to look at. He's got 9 different principles. So there's a couple of them here. So I'll just read them all in a row, and then we'll look at them one by one. The 9 requirements are: 1, sinking; 2, hollowing; 3, lifting; 4, pressing; 5, wrapping; 6, loosening; 7, hanging; 8, shrinking; 9, clearly distinguishing between lifting, drilling, dropping, and overturning. But the first 2 are kind of matched together. Sinking means your waist has an energy of sinking down, the principle of your tailbone lifting and activating your du meridian. Whereas the second principle, hollowing, means opening your chest inwardly to smooth your energy, the principle of passive energy descending along your Ren meridian.
Right.
So, that is straight from Taoist alchemy right there. So your waist, your Yao Qua, has the energy of sinking down. So that's when we do that training, we sink into the Qua and sort of settle into the legs.
Yeah, the phrase that is used to describe that in Tai Chi is raise the spine and drop the chest. Hong Shun Babe, right? It's that lifting of the back, dropping of the front. So this is just another way of saying, you have something going up the back and something coming down the front.
So you sink and sit into your waist, allowing your spine to rise. He calls it the tailbone lifting, to activate the back du meridian going up.
Yeah. This is, again, these
talk about a dichotomy. You sink into it in order to cause the spine to rise.
That's Peng Ji in Tai Chi, right? You're dropping down to get something to make your arms go up.
Then there's this hollowing of opening your chest inwardly, which in what we've trained, you would call opening the shoulders nest and softening the chest to allow energy to smoothly, passively drop down the front, the Ren meridian.
Yeah, this is relaxing your chest without collapsing your spine and letting your belly relax, essentially.
And like you're saying, this is that first struggle that you have. You lift through the top of your head and your chest sticks out. But if you hunch forward and try to hollow yourself, then your spine gets kinked and your chin comes forward. So you've got to keep wavering between the two to try and get those two to link a little bit on a pretty physical level, right? This isn't some energy technique. This is physical.
Yeah. Another one that's really tough for people is to get the sense of dropping the tailbone while lifting the back of the knee. right? That it's that same kind of thing that when people first try to quote unquote drop their tailbone, usually what they end up doing is pushing their knees forward. And when they try to sit into their Gua without moving their knees, what they end up doing is kind of pushing their hips back.
Or sticking your butt out, maybe.
Or sticking their, that's the worst case scenario. So what eventually you're looking for is an internal space connection where you're able to, the same way you're able to lift your head and drop your chest without it pulling on all that stuff in between, you're able to drop your tailbone, not push it forward, I should mention, drop it, which means go down. Your pelvis isn't moving, and lift the joints inside your legs so that your knees don't bend, right? And this is how you stand essentially in Qigong and stuff, where you're not squatting down into a horse stance and putting your knees 4 inches in front of your toes. You're dropping through your body and sinking into it. So this idea of hollowing is really more of, I would translate it as creating space.
So hollow the shoulders nest, create space in the shoulders and chest.
Yeah, but it's your shoulders, but it's also your midriff and your quad and the back of your knees and the backs of your ankles. It's any part of your body that can open and expand and hollow.
And he calls hollowing opening inwardly, which is an interesting way of saying it, because you think opening would be going out like this, but he's saying you open inward into yourself.
Yeah, Bruce talks about cavities, right? These spaces inside your body, and that these cavities can fill up like a balloon, but they can also shrink and pull inward. And this is how you develop the first big Neigong is just that ability to get that up and down, right?
So the next couple seem like it's almost like two of them match with two. So the first two are lifting and pressing. So lifting is lifting your perineum or rectum inward, and pressing means your tongue touches the upper palate. So there's a sense of rising through the center, basically.
Yeah, that lifting one, oh boy.
The head presses up and your hands press up. That's ding, where the top of your head pushes up.
They always say rectum. It isn't your rectum. You're not tight. You're not pulling your anus upward. That is a practice, but that to me, that's one that's really dangerous. And it's not, I don't think, what they're really referring to. What they're referring to is the ability to lift from your perineum up to the top of your head with these sort of fine ligaments that go up your spine. So it's this rising, lengthening up from the very base of your tailbone all the way up your spine. So that's just my kind of take on it. And then the pressing the palate one, that's pretty common, where you just push the tongue on the roof of your mouth.
Right. And that's the one that kind of helps you get that up and down Ren and Du meridian thing. If you get that lifting in the top of the head, that really helps you get the hollowing and the sinking that you're trying to do previously.
Yeah, it's kind of like reinforcing the previous two, I think. Yeah.
And so what I was seeing is paired with those are loosening and hanging. Loosening, these other ones were upward movement. These ones are downward. Loosening means loosening your shoulders as when drawing a bow, keeping your elbows from poking outward. Tanging means when your hands twist outward, the elbows have a strong energy of hanging down. So I think those help balance that. Lifting is to loosening the shoulders and let the arms hang, rather than lifting your shoulders up with you while you're lifting the top of your head. Yeah,
again, this is sort of way I would say it is, he's just describing their body method, right? He's describing the way in which you're going to attempt to hold your body as you practice, right? And so these are guidelines for how you would do that.
Right. These are sort of a checklist you can go through. Yeah. Next, he talks about wrapping, meaning your elbows have an energy of wrapping inward. If your hands are holding something up with the palms up, there has to be an energy of wrapping inward. So that's on a sort of a horizontal plane. Those other ones were up and down. This one's on that lateral level where you're wrapping.
Right. So you've got up and down. The hollowing is sort of the forward and back, and now you're adding this wrapping, which is this sort of this coming around feeling. So it's the feeling of bringing that which is in the back to the front,
and with coming around to the front.
But also when you go the other way, bringing that which is from the front to the back. So. And
another one that might pair with wrapping is shrinking, meaning your shoulders and hips have a strong energy of shrinking in. So this returns to Liu Tan Shi Hua, that sense of your shoulders and hips open inward and sink in on themselves as you wrap around from the back to the front, creating that. I remember one time Bruce said it was like tying up a package, a Christmas present, and wrapping the ribbon around. Bagua has this feeling of everything, the central core being really strong and sturdy, and then you wrap around it, and it all sort of weaves together, and it creates a strength, a group strength. If all these things wind together in a flexible way, it's like a rope that has all tons of different strands in it. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The term Bruce tends to use for this is like kobu, right? The turning in step is called kobu, and the ko is this action of two things kind of wrapping towards the center. So you're trying to get that feeling, for example, in your hands, but also in your shoulders and in your hips. And
so he ends with the idea of lifting, drilling, dropping, and overturning. This is the slogan that a bunch of internal martial arts: rise, drill, overturn, fall. That you find it in a lot of the different motions of Tai Chi and Xing Yi as well.
Right.
And so all the rest of them are sort of postural requirements, but this one refers to striking. Strike with lifting and dropping, like the wheels of machinery spinning continuously. So it's not just a chop. It's like there's a loop to it where you keep the energy and you recycle the energy by lifting, drilling, then dropping and overturning, and lifting and drilling. There's a cycle to it of a machine just rolling forward relentlessly.
Yeah, and he says that the actual name for the thing is clearly distinguishing between those four things. So it isn't just making that motion, it's actually being able to feel how you're making that motion.
The drilling and rising.
And how the
overturning and falling.
Right, and how they morph into each other, I think is really that sense of, similar to the way you do the commencement in Tai Chi, how you have four parts of a movement that essentially make a circle, and you're trying to make those four parts one thing. So this is, again, sort of that, to go back to the
you
Taoist.
Break it up, but you combine it again.
First, you break it up into its parts, but then you bring it back into a single thing.
To an organic, yeah. So you differentiate it, but then you roll like wheels of machinery spinning continuously when you put it into action.
Separate, then combine.
Yeah,
exactly. Hey, folks, thanks for listening. Again, check out the Patreon for the next portion of this episode. Also, check out our Instagram for images to go along with the episodes. Leave us a review on iTunes, and like and subscribe, and take care of yourself.